Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 331. Today, we're going to be looking at the paper A Lockean Argument for Black Reparations by Bernard Boxill. And this will take us up to the end of our unit on property rights and inequality. And this will be a continuation of the discussion we started last week on reparations. Last week, we were looking at reparations and rights of reparation for indigenous people. This week, we're going to be looking at reparations and the right of reparations for African Americans. So here's the plan. We're going to look at some info about Boxill. We're going to consider some basic information about the reparations debate. We're going to consider the counterfactual argument, as Boxill calls it, and we'll think about some problems with that argument. And then we're going to look at Boxill's inheritance argument. I say video part 2 right here. That's actually a mistake. We're going to stop at the end of our discussion of the inheritance argument, and then we'll move on to what we'll call Boxill's revised counterfactual argument. So here's just some basic info about Bernard Boxill. He has taught at UNC Chapel Hill for many years, started there in 1991, and is now a professor emeritus there. His book, Blacks and Social Justice, came out in 1984 and had a second edition in 92. And he's published very widely on issues related to race and racism. So he's done philosophical work on questions about preferential hiring, affirmative action, reparations, and integration. Of course, today our topic is going to be reparations. And Boxill does a really nice job of drawing on social contract theory and related Enlightenment thinkers. So he has a very keen eye for thinking about how race and racism has affected these foundational thinkers. Moreover, the ways in which Enlightenment ideas might be able to help us understand and diagnose race and racism-related issues. Just to think about the reparations debate a bit more, this is definitely within the realm of our question about distributive justices, right? Because it's about whether we can normatively justify inequalities of wealth and also access to social opportunities. And when we think about measures of wealth, that is monetary holdings and the market value of all your property and debts, there is a large racial wealth gap in America. So let's see. So, the median wealth in America in 83, it was $84,000. It actually got lower by 2016. It went down to $81,000. But if you do this question by race, you'll see that wealth has increased for white Americans. For Black Americans, it's gotten down by more than half. And we've seen for Latinos here on this chart that they too suffer from very low amounts of wealth. When we think about median wealth. And we can see that these wealth gaps are growing, that white Americans have gotten richer, Latino Americans have barely gotten richer, Latinx Americans have barely gotten richer, whereas Black Americans have gotten a lot less. And this issue about reparations has become a much discussed issue in more recent years. So in 2014, the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates published an article that generated a whole lot of discussion, not just in philosophy, but in the public realm, about the case for reparations. So this is something that's very much a live issue nowadays. But what we're going to be looking at is an earlier article from 2003 by Boxill that shows that, philosophers have been on top of this and thinking about this for a lot longer than it's been at the forefront of public discussion. So, Boxill's big idea in this paper is that he's basically claiming that if we think consistently about John Locke and his principles, well, that John Locke would actually support reparations for African Americans nowadays if he were consistent. So here's what Locke tells us. Not only is this a central point in Boxill's essay from 2003, it is actually a quotation that comes right at the start of Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay on reparations as well. But here's what Locke said in his second treatise of government. He says, besides the crime of violating the rule of reason, there is commonly injury done to a person or other, and some other man receives damage by his transgression, in which case he who hath received any damage has besides a right of punishment. So you'll recall that Locke said that in the state of nature, you have the right to punish someone for violating your rights. But you also have a particular right to seek reparation from him that has done it. So if you are harmed by some other person, one of your natural rights, along with life, liberty, and property, is a right to seek reparation from your wrongdoers. So, what does Boxill draw from what Locke is saying? Well, he says that a right of reparation is something that only belongs to an injured party to repair harms or violations of right. And the idea is that a transgression and a harm are both necessary preconditions for reparation. So when we say necessary preconditions for reparation, if you don't have a harm, then you can't be given reparation. So if somebody breaks a promise to you, but it makes you no worse off, then you don't have any right to reparation. Moreover, there has to be a transgression. So just because I accidentally harm you, or perhaps harm you in a way that's not a violation of your rights. So, we might think about a person harming somebody out of self-defense, right? There's no right of reparation on the person who was harmed by the person just defending themselves. Moreover, reparations must compensate the injured party. So they're not the same thing as punishment, right? Because a punishment is just as much a matter of disincentivizing a bad action rather than focusing on making the harmed party better off. And reparations can only be paid by a transgressor, so they're different from compensation. So the thought here is that if I were robbed and the government paid me back the value of what I lost, that would just be compensation. Only if I'm paid back the value of what I lose by the transgressor should we really think about that payment as a reparation. So the way that we think about it is if there's a transgressor and a victim, and the victim is harmed as a result, that is when there is a right of reparation. Boxill further points out that the amount of profit on a transgressor's part is irrelevant. So even if the transgressor was not destitute, that would still give them an obligation to make reparation. But even if they were destitute, they would have an obligation to make reparation. So, according to Boxill, it seems clear to him that slaves were entitled to seek reparation from slaveholders. So the thought here is that it's obvious that the American system of chattel slavery was a violation of the slave's rights. And Boxill also thinks that it's clear to him that the U.S. government unjustly perpetuated the institution of slavery. And we'll continue with that matter a little bit more as we go on. So here's one way we might start to think about reparations is in terms of what Boxill is calling the counterfactual argument. So the first pass of this argument comes on pages 66 to 67 of your reading. So the first premise is just that slavery has harmed present-day Americans. As Boxill puts it, this is the kind of premise that nobody that he would talk to, nobody worth taking seriously, is going to deny that it was clearly a harmful and abhorrent practice. Then two, people have a right to seek reparation from those who have harmed them. So that's basically just Locke's point. So this is how we're making this a Lockean argument. So then three, compensation for a harm is a matter of bringing a person to the level of well-being they'd be at if they hadn't been harmed. So the idea is that present-day African Americans are entitled to seek reparation that will bring them to the level of well-being they would be at if slavery had not occurred. So in fact, this claim is actually a bit more tendentious than I let on. It's clear that slavery harmed Africans and slaves who were involuntarily taken to do menial labor. It's a more difficult question about whether that institution that began in the 17th century in America has an effect on present-day African Americans. So Boxill points out a couple of problems with this first version of the counterfactual argument, right? Remember, the counterfactual argument is just based on this word counterfactual. We came across this word when we were working on Waldron. The idea of a counterfactual is it's what things would be like if something that hadn't happened did happen, right? So we say something like, if Kennedy had not been assassinated, then he would have won re-election, right? So it's talking about what the world would have turned out like if something that didn't happen actually did happen. So here are a couple of problems that Boxill points out, things that he says are going to make this argument one that is disputable. He says, first, it's hard to know what level of well-being African Americans would be at if slavery had not occurred. So it's hard to say exactly how much wealth. So if we go back to this argument, if slavery had not occurred, exactly where would Black Americans be on this chart? Where would white Americans be? So it's hard to know exactly what this chart would look like. Second one is that present-day generations would not exist if slavery hadn't happened. The thought here is just that, if a certain series of historical events had not happened, then, different children would have been conceived. Many people's parents wouldn't have even met, and even if your parents had met and had children, they might have conceived different children with different genetics at slightly different times. So for any particular person who exists nowadays, they would not exist if slavery hadn't happened. If slavery hadn't happened, the Civil War would not have happened. And if the Civil War would not have happened, then basically anybody born after the Civil War wouldn't have come into existence. Even if your parents had met, the resulting children that they have would be different ones. So Boxill suggests that he wants to develop versions of Lockean reparation arguments that are going to avoid these problems. So we're going to look at the inheritance argument, and then we're going to take a quick break, and in our second video we're going to look at a revised version of this counterfactual argument. So here's a couple of thoughts that Boxill is giving us that's going to give us something to work with to make a new argument that doesn't run into those problems. This one problem we might call the historical complexity objection, and the second one we sometimes in philosophy refer to this problem, that if a bad thing had not happened, then you would not exist. This is sometimes called the non-identity problem. So how do we avoid the historical complexity objection and the non-identity problem? So the first point is that present-day African Americans are heirs of slaves. So the thought is an heir gets to inherit the entitlements and the debts of their parents. So because they acquire rights to their ancestors' entitlements, heirs have a right to reparations that the government owed to their ancestors. And we can note that we do transfer property rights and debts to our descendants all the time, right? If you don't have a will and you do have accumulated property when you die, the first people it will go to are your descendants. So there's an important difference here from the counterfactual argument. It doesn't depend on the claim that present-day African Americans have been harmed by slavery, right? It could be the case that African Americans could have improved their social condition more so than they have. Boxill isn't claiming that, but he's saying that this argument is consistent with that claim. And it could be the case that even if African Americans were extremely well off, even if they did have the same amount of wealth that white Americans or just the average American has, that in and of itself would not cancel their right to reparations. So it doesn't matter how much or how little slavery harms you, right? It's just the idea that slaves originally had a right to reparation. That's just a natural right that they have when their own rights are violated. And then that entitlement to seek reparation then is acquired by their ancestors. By their descendants, and those descendants acquire that entitlement and so forth. So here's how the inheritance argument looks. It says, if someone's ancestors are owed compensation for a harm, then these ancestors have a claim to collect compensation. Then we say, well, present-day African Americans' ancestors were harmed by slavery. This is kind of the view that nobody worth taking seriously is going to deny, right? Actual slaves definitely had their rights violated. So then 3, present-day African Americans have a claim to collect compensation, right? The thought here is that the slaves are entitled compensation, And if the slaves are entitled compensation, then the ancestors of slaves have a claim to collect compensation. Therefore, present-day African Americans, who are heirs, have a claim to collect that compensation. So Boxill does not claim that we have an unconditional right to claim inheritance. So whereas Corlett last time around said that when it comes to reparations for egregious rights violations, we should basically do it no matter how much it hurts, as a way of saying basically that anything less than complete compensation would be an insult. Well, Boxill is going to put some limits on the right of inheritance. So there's a question here about whether there's anybody we can claim inheritance from, or whether we can claim reparation from anyone. So the thought is, isn't it wrong to transfer debts from slave holders to people who never actively participated in slavery? So the thought here is it's not clear that today's government is the same government as the one that upheld slavery. Boxill points out that it's not impossible to inherit debts, right? We inherit debts from our parents and our families. Moreover, if you join a firm, a company, then you can acquire the debts that that firm has already taken on. But in spite of that, Boxill points out that we can't leave future generations with debts that exceed what we leave to them. And moreover, these debts cannot become so burdensome to limit the freedom of future generations. So when we get down to the details of the inheritance argument, Boxill does need to make the claim, which seems plausible to him, that the present generation of white Americans did inherit benefits from slavery, and that present-day black Americans are heirs to slaves. And Boxill is going to point out that inheriting the benefits of slavery is something that white immigrants who arrived in the U.S. after the abolition of slavery can acquire. So his thought is that later immigrants to the U.S. Are still benefiting from advantages and assets created by slavery. So the thought here might be that there's a certain kind of white privilege that exists, which later white immigrants benefit from as well. So even though Boxill does say, yeah, these immigrants who come to America and work hard, they do own their earnings, but they may be required to pay compensation for unjustly acquired opportunities. You don't own the opportunities that gave rise to your earnings. So if you are a beneficiary of slavery, then you may well have benefited from opportunities that you didn't earn and that were the result of an injustice. So some of these points about counterbalancing the right of inheritance might be familiar when we think about Waldron's point from last time around, which is basically that we have to take a forward-looking view when it comes to justice. So here are some basic ideas about the limit to the inheritance argument that Boxill is pointing out. He points out that inheritance rights can't make others destitute, right? He says, my right to inherit something from another person can't make others vulnerable to exploitation. and we can't charge so much reparation on a person that it puts them in danger of perishing. But we've got an empirical claim here, and Boxill says here that that's not the case in the US. So he thinks that the US could have made reparation to African Americans and would have suffered only mild discomfort at worst. So with that in mind, that's going to be how Boxill thinks about the details of the inheritance argument, which again says that if someone's ancestors are owed compensation for a harm, then these ancestors have a claim to collect compensation. Present-day African Americans' ancestors were harmed by slavery and thereby were owed compensation for those harms. So present-day African Americans have a claim to collect that compensation. So that's going to be the end of part one. We're going to pick it up again in a second video to look at what we might call a revised counterfactual argument that Boxill sees as worth defending. So get up, have a stretch, maybe take a quick little walk, and I will check in with you again with the second part on Boxill. All right, thanks for listening in.